Misinformation comes from multiple sources, and it's important to understand the difference. First, there is misinformation driven by media and social platforms. Sometimes it's intentional, designed to mislead or push an agenda. Other times, it's simply sensationalized reporting that lacks scientific rigor. But misinformation does not always stem from deliberate deception. It can also arise within legitimate scientific research. But unlike media-driven misinformation, this is not about intentionally misleading the public. It's about the evolving nature of scientific discovery, but we will talk more about this later. In any case, these forms of misinformation can create confusion, which is why it's so important to understand how knowledge is built, how to evaluate its reliability, and how to distinguish strong evidence from misleading claims. So one of the most common questions I get from my students is, hey, I read an article that says one thing, but then I found another source saying the exact opposite. So who do I trust? Easy, you don't, because research is not built on trust. You trust your wife, you trust your friends. Research relies on verification, or as we say in academic circles, replication and reproducibility. But let's be honest, most of us don't have the time to sift through hundreds of studies every time we need to make a decision. So we look for shortcuts. We seek out people who can give us clear answers, experts, thought leaders, or trusted institutions. Now the problem, well, if I don't know much about a topic, I also don't know enough to determine who is right and who is wrong. Think about it. If I already knew how to fact-check experts, I wouldn't need one in the first place. But if I rely on an expert because I lack knowledge, then I also lack the ability to judge who truly is an expert. So what do? Well, we take mental shortcuts. We rely on professional titles, popularity, or just the vibe we get from a person. But often we overestimate how good our instincts are. Psychological research has shown that our brains make snap judgments often subconsciously, and these judgments shape who we trust. For example, one study examined how similarity and mimicry affect trust decisions. The findings suggest that both shared characteristics and mimicry independently enhance trust, highlighting the impact of similarity bias in our social interactions. Another study indicates that venture capitalists often prefer startup teams that mirror their own backgrounds in terms of training and professional experience. Now, this similarity bias can influence investment decisions, potentially limiting diversity in entrepreneurial ventures. Now, these biases might have helped our ancestors survive in small, close-knit communities, but in today's world where we engage with thousands of people online, these instinctive reactions can be highly misleading. And then there are credentials. Yes, degrees and expertise matter, but spend just 5 minutes online and you will see PhDs and professionals openly contradicting each other on major topics. So titles do not guarantee accuracy. And of course, many people place their trust in personality, charisma, confidence, or how real someone appears. But here's the catch. Someone can be 100% sincere and still be 100% wrong. So how do we move past this? Well, the key is to shift our focus from the individual to the information itself, less who and more what. However, that's unnatural for us because our brains are wired to do the exact opposite, because we lack a method to objectively evaluate research. And this is more urgent than ever because the way we consume information today has fundamentally changed. We are no longer passive recipients of knowledge. We are constantly bombarded with fragmented, emotionally charged content, all competing for our attention. And that's precisely why the biggest debates in the news or on social media often revolve around what we should fear, reject, or distrust. Think about it. There's the debate over vaccines, whether they are life-saving or dangerous. The discussion around climate change, whether it's an urgent crisis or a hoax. AI, whether it will revolutionize our work or make humans obsolete. 5G technology, whether it's a breakthrough in connectivity or a hidden health risk. Even mainstream media, whether it delivers facts or pushes an agenda. Influencers and commentators today are not just telling us what's happening, they are telling us what we should be afraid of, what we shouldn't trust, shouldn't believe, or shouldn't use. And it's everywhere. Instead of focusing on what's true, what works, or what we can learn, news and social media thrive on what's wrong, what's dangerous, and what we must avoid. Even new technologies, which should be about innovation and progress, these are introduced through the lens of what they will replace, disrupt, and destroy, not what they will improve. But isn't that a little strange? Can you imagine trying to sell a laptop or a phone by listing all the other phones you shouldn't buy instead of explaining why yours is the best choice? Why do news and social media thrive on negativity? Because fear is one of the most powerful human emotions. If you can generate fear, doubt, or controversy, you immediately capture people's attention. And we see this reflected in the language used online and in the news. It's not neutral, it's not analytical, it's emotional and negative. Ideas, people, science, and technologies are not just debated, they are labeled as dangerous, corrupt, a scam, or toxic. Now, the problem, well, fear inhibits, blocks our ability to think critically. And one suitable quote is by Marie Curie, who said, "Nothing in life is to be feared, it is only to be understood. Now is the time to understand more so that we may fear less," which of course implies that there's a trade-off between fear and understanding. And we see this trade-off everywhere. News headlines, viral debates, internet fads. Fear grabs our attention, but it does not teach us how to evaluate information, verify sources, or develop rational opinions. So we end up in a world where some people fear medicine, others fear science, others fear the media itself, while some resort to conspiracy theories instead of taking the time to truly analyze and understand. So the question is, how can we break out of this cycle? Well, what I can do in this webinar is share some critical tools that can help you take control of your decisions based on valid, fact-checked information and reliability. These are the skills researchers learn over the years of conducting scientific research. As Liam Neeson might say, they form a very particular set of skills, skills that have truly transformed my life. I use them every day, not just professionally, but in my personal life and with the people around me. And they have enriched our lives in ways I couldn't have imagined. And this is how we will start. We will begin with the indicators of misinformation, the three I's as I call them. And the first red flag of misinformation, the first I, the first red flag of misinformation is individual stories. Because we are wired to connect with personal stories, they make things feel real. A compelling story sticks in our minds much more than a statistical analysis. But the problem, individual stories are unreliable. Whether it's a testimonial about a business strategy, a personal success story in tech, or a claim about a scientific breakthrough, individual experiences do not prove causation, reliability, or general applicability to broader contexts. In social sciences, anecdotal evidence can be deeply misleading if not backed by structured, qualitative, and quantitative research. In my field, computer science or in engineering, a single successful test in a simulated environment does not mean the same outcome will occur in real-world applications. In business, one viral startup success story does not mean the same strategy will work for everyone. Or in medicine, a single patient's recovery after using a particular treatment does not prove the treatment is effective. There are factors like placebo effects, individual biology, external conditions, genetics, epigenetics all play a role. So if a claim is heavily reliant on individual stories rather than systematic analysis, be skeptical. And none of us are immune to this. A well-known example of this story occurred in the mid-20th century when Pediatrician Dr. Spock advised parents to place babies on their stomachs to sleep, believing it would reduce the risk of choking. And many parents followed this advice, and personal stories reinforced the belief that it was safer. But here's a problem. By 1970, research was already showing a statistically significant increase in the risk of SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome, for babies sleeping on their stomachs compared to their backs. In fact, studies at the time found that front sleeping more than doubled the risk of SIDS with an odds ratio of 2.93. Now, let me pause for a second. What is this odds ratio? Well, in research, scientists use something called an odds ratio to measure risk. So if the odds ratio is 1, it means there is no difference in risk. If it's greater than 1, it means the risk is higher. So in this case, an odds ratio of 3, as you can see, meant that babies sleeping on their stomachs had 3 times the risk of SIDS compared to those sleeping on their backs. And as more data emerged, the evidence became even clearer. Yet, despite these findings, it took decades before health guidelines changed. And when they finally did, the SIDS rates dropped dramatically. So the lesson, just because an idea is widespread and supported by individual stories, does not mean it is correct. Proper research and systematic studies are essential. The second red flag, ideological balance. And we have all seen this tribalism in debates. One group insists their business strategy is the only one that works, while others are clueless. One camp in politics declares that a certain policy is universally good or bad, ignoring all nuances. And of course, we saw the same pattern during the COVID-19 debate. You remember that early in the pandemic, people split into extreme camps, some arguing that lockdowns were the only solution, while others insisted they were completely unnecessary. Some believed that masks were either completely useless or absolute lifesavers. And of course, debates over vaccines followed the same pattern. Either they were a miraculous cure or a dangerous conspiracy. But when discussions turn into an us versus them mindset, the pursuit of truth disappears. Because real research and the advancement of knowledge rely on open debate, rely on nuance, and the willingness to question assumptions, not on dismissing or attacking opposing views. So if someone is more concerned with winning an argument than engaging with the actual evidence, that's a red flag. Stay skeptical. And the third red flag is intense emotion. Ever heard the phrase, they lie to us? Whether it's about AI replacing jobs or economic policies or climate change debates, many discussions are driven by outrage and frustration. But intense emotions cloud our ability to think clearly. They push us to look for evidence that supports what we already believe instead of weighing all the facts. Because skepticism is healthy, but when it turns into constant outrage, it becomes a sign of bias. Because at the end of the day, skepticism is not about rejecting everything, it's about critically evaluating everything. Which brings us to another major issue, the way research itself is brought to the world. So in today's world, groundbreaking discoveries no longer emerge from lone scientists working in isolation like Archimedes shouting Eureka in his bathtub. Instead, innovation is a result of systematic, collaborative efforts driven by structured scientific methodologies that, as I said, ensure replication and reproducibility. For instance, one such approach is design science research. This is a framework widely used in my field, in information systems. And this methodology, as you can see, follows a rigorous sequence of steps, identifying a problem, designing and developing solutions, and evaluating them. The final and crucial step in this process is communication, sharing findings with the scientific community and the world. So every technological breakthrough, every piece of software we now use, every major advancement in science, medical procedures, or business strategy, these innovations are all built on discoveries that were first reported in scientific studies. Scientific research quietly shapes the world around us, yet most people have little understanding of how this process actually works. Scientific research is communicated in various ways, but not all forms go through the same level of scrutiny. So if you have ever attended a conference, a scientific conference, or browsed a preprint server or read a peer-reviewed journal, you have seen different types of scientific output, and each serves its own purpose, but they vary significantly in reliability. We have posters. Posters are often the first place new research appears. They are presented at conferences, giving researchers a chance to share early stage findings, brainstorm with peers, and gather feedback before submitting to a journal. But it's important to remember there is no formal peer review process. So what you see on a poster is entirely up to the researcher, which means that posters may include errors, misinterpretations, or incomplete results. In some cases, they present findings that will not hold up under closer scrutiny. And a recent example is a study presented as a poster at the American Heart Association's conference a year ago, which claimed that an 8-hour time-restricted eating pattern was linked to a higher risk of cardiovascular death. Now, remember the odds ratio I explained earlier? Similarly, the hazard ratio of 1.91 in the study that I highlighted means that individuals following an 8-hour time-restricted eating window had a 91% higher risk of cardiovascular death compared to those without dietary time restrictions, 91%. That's, of course, a significant increase. The finding sparked widespread discussion and alarm as intermittent fasting has been promoted as a health-boosting dietary strategy, a popular one. However, upon closer examination, the study was observational, relied on self-reported dietary habits, and did not establish causation, only a correlation. More importantly, because this was a conference poster, it had not yet undergone peer review. As we will see later, without expert scrutiny, the results could be affected by confounding variables, methodological limitations, or statistical anomalies. And yet, despite these uncertainties, as you can see, the claim made headlines, fueling public debates before the scientific process had a chance to validate it or refute it. Then we have preprints. Preprints take it a step further. There are full research papers that are uploaded to public servers before, again, being reviewed by experts. But they allow rapid sharing of ideas, making them really popular in fast-moving fields like AI, computer science, or medicine. There are platforms like SSRN, preprint.org that have made preprints more accessible than ever. But again, preprints are not peer-reviewed. Just like posters, they can contain flaws, miscalculations, or conclusions that do not hold up under further analysis. In fact, some preprints gain media attention before experts have had a chance to scrutinize them, leading again to misinformation. And a well-known example of preprint misinformation occurred during the COVID-19 pandemic, when a preprint study suggested that hydroxychloroquine was an effective treatment for COVID-19. And you might remember that during that time, every scientist was desperately searching for a cure for COVID-19. Now, the study, lacking proper randomization and controls, gained widespread attention, leading to policy changes, stockpiling, and even self-medication. However, later peer-reviewed trials debunked its efficacy, showing no benefit and potential harm, particularly to heart health. Now, this case highlights the risk of relying on unverified sources, as premature conclusions can mislead the public and influence real-world decisions before proper scrutiny, as I said, is applied. So, the most reliable source of information comes from peer-reviewed papers, research that has been rigorously examined by experts before publication. And I think now is a good opportunity to pull back the curtain a little bit and show how this process actually works. And I'm referring to the peer review process. So when you think you have made a significant discovery, whether it's a new algorithm, a new medicine, a novel approach to cybersecurity, or a breakthrough in automation, so you write up your findings and submit them to a scientific journal like this one. Now, if the editors of that journal believe your work has potential, has merit, They forward it to other experts in the field for an independent evaluation. That's what we call the peer review process. Now, a few months, or if you're lucky, a few weeks later, you receive an email like this. And inside are these anonymous reports labeled something like Reviewer A and Reviewer B thoroughly critiquing your work. Every detail in your paper is examined, every assumption questioned. If there's a flaw, they'll catch it. And then it's back to the drawing board. You revise your argument. If it's a major revision, conduct additional analysis and experiments, and strengthen your case until your findings are solid enough to be published. Now, there are some open peer-reviewed journals where you can view the reviews of submitted papers. And one example that you can visit is the Journal of Semantic Web if you want to see what the review reports look like. Simply click the All Reviewed Articles link, select a paper, and then click to expand link, and the reviews will be publicly available. As I said, some reviews are minor, while others are major and require significant effort from researchers. In any case, it's a whole dance, and over time you get better at it. Now, my fastest paper went from submission to publication in about 2 months, which is lightning speed in academia. Now, the longest one that took almost 3 years, but that's just part of the process. Peer review is the backbone of scientific quality control. It can be frustrating, I know, and at times you might feel like strangling at least one of your reviewers, but it's absolutely essential. It's what separates solid research from everything else. Because books, blogs, LinkedIn posts, YouTube videos, Facebook posts, there's no peer review process for those. Anyone can say whatever they want, and many do. In contrast, peer review research has been challenged, has been refined, and made to withstand a level of scrutiny that no social media post ever could. It's a bit like Churchill's famous line about democracy. It's the worst system, except for all the others. The same applies to peer review. Yes, it has flaws like democracy, but every alternative we have tried is even worse, so it remains the best option we have. So once a paper is accepted, the journal publishes it, making it accessible to researchers worldwide, and future generations can cite it, build upon it, and continue advancing the field. So decades from now, long after we are gone, the work we have done will still be contributing to something greater than ourselves. But I know now what some of you are thinking. All of this sounds like it only applies to scientists, right? If you are not working in a lab, conducting experiments, or writing academic papers, does any of this really matter? Well, it's easy to assume that evaluating research is only for experts, something that demands a PhD, access to academic databases, libraries, and years of specialized training. And while it's true that professional scientists devote their careers to mastering these methods, the core principles are accessible to everyone. Because the truth is, every one of us makes decisions based on information every single day. You don't need to be a scientist to come across research, whether it's about your health, your tech choices, your work, your education, or your everyday routines, your habits. You're already making decisions based on what you read, hear, and see. So the real question is, how can you be sure you're not being misled? And that's where doing your own research becomes essential. And yes, I know the phrase "I did my own research" has become a bit of a meme, often tied to misinformation and conspiracy theories. But the truth is, doing your own research can be incredibly valuable if you do it right. Done wrong, though, it can be just as misleading as the misinformation you're trying to avoid. I've been conducting scientific research professionally as an academic professor in the Department of Digital Systems at the University of Thessaly in Greece. Today, beyond my teaching responsibilities, research is not just something I do, it's a core part of my job. But I also use these same principles every day, whether I'm evaluating the latest developments in computer science or in a different domain trying to understand new theories and guidelines, or analyzing a strategy that seems too good to be true. So what I'd like to do next is make all of that practical. We will take a short 5-minute break, and when we come back, we will dive into the practical part of this webinar. First, I'll show you the research tools that scientists use every day to navigate complex information so you can start using them too. Then I'll walk you through two real-life demonstrations so you can see exactly how these tools work in high-stakes decisions. We will also break down the research hierarchy. This is important to help you understand why some studies matter more than others. I'll show you how to spot red flags in claims and how to recognize biases. And finally, we'll explore how generative AI is already transforming research and education, what it can do, where it helps, and where we need to be careful. So take a short stretch, grab some water, and I'll see you in 5. Okay, welcome back. Let's jump into the second part of the webinar. So, as I said, the problem with doing your own research is that by definition, you are starting without deep expertise in the subject. Um, I'm going to check if I'm okay. Yes. So, the question is, how can we separate reliable information from misleading claims when we may not even have the foundational knowledge to evaluate them properly? And most people do what feels natural. They turn to Google, type in the question, like in this example, and are instantly flooded with thousands of blogs, YouTube videos, and opinion pieces. But that's like jumping into the deep end of a pool without knowing how to swim. We need something to hold on to, something that can guide us through all that noise. And in practice, scientists do not just hope on Google when they are looking for answers. They use structured research databases designed to filter out unreliable sources and surface peer-reviewed studies. Researchers use databases like IEEE Explore or ACM Digital Library, or they go to Springer, Nature, or Science Direct to find solid technical studies. Now, these platforms do not just serve up random articles. They provide research that has been reviewed, research that has been analyzed and critiqued by other experts in the field. I use these databases every single day for years, although lately I've been using Google Scholar a lot more. It has a few advantages that we will explore. Essentially, it works like Google, but it's filtered for peer-reviewed research, so much of the work of separating the wheat from the chaff is already done for us, and that's good. So let's say I want to research a computer science issue. Say I'm studying learning analytics. I just enter it here, and you get thousands of hits. Now, each of those entries is a research paper, and we could just add more search terms to make it more specific. Learning analytics algorithms, which gives us, as you can see, a lot less hits, more specific, right? We can also use quotes for a specific expression, just like on Google. For example, learning analytics and higher education. Now, another cool feature is restricting the date. So I can limit the search to articles that are 4, 3, or 1 year old maximum. Just click here where it says 2025, and now I have a lot less hits, less than 2,000. Another cool little trick is the star icon. So if we click that, it saves the study in our reading list. So click down and now just go here where it says my library. And the studies we selected are all saved here. So we can basically go through all the hits and move the ones we like to our list to read later. And we can actually organize the list with different labels, which allows you to group studies into different sublists if you are researching different topics. For example, you could have a label for learning analytics and one for educational data mining and so forth. We can also do an advanced search. Click this menu icon on the top left on the Google Scholar page and click advanced search. And here you can specify several words that must all be present. You can specify an exact phrase. This is the same as the quotes that we looked at. You can exclude words, you can search by author and so forth. But probably the most important feature of Google Scholar is the links on the right side of each tile. Now, those are the full text versions. So if a free access version is available online, it will be listed there, which is incredibly convenient. Now, clicking the actual title might take you to a paywall, but those side links, full text, like magic. And quite a few studies include them. Now, for articles behind paywalls, some researchers turn to platforms like Sci-Hub, which provide access to academic papers. However, it's important to know that Sci-Hub operates in a legal gray area, I can say. So always make sure you're following local laws and your institution's policies when accessing academic papers. Okay, now I want to show you another hidden gem that a lot of people do not know about. So another cool feature on Google Scholar is the ability to filter results to show only review articles. For example, narrative reviews offer a broad overview of a topic. They're especially useful for beginners to get a general sense of the field. Review articles are generally more helpful because single studies usually reflect just one experiment or one interpretation of the results. That's why it is better to look at several studies or read a review that summarizes many of them before forming an opinion. Because the truth is, a single study does not prove much. What really matters is a body of research, multiple studies that have been replicated and reviewed over time. But the problem is, most people do not realize that research exists on a hierarchy. So if we exclude non-peer-reviewed sources, such as individual stories, posters, preprints, which we have made clear should not be considered reliable, even peer-reviewed studies can still be confusing, even for experts. Whether it's AI, cybersecurity, engineering, or medicine, conflicting claims seem to appear everywhere. One study argues that a model is the most accurate, while another says it's unreliable. The same happens in medicine. Like in this example, if you can see the first says that the supplement is effective, the second study says it's ineffective. But if findings often contradict each other, how can we determine which study is more reliable? Well, we need to realize that what often seem like contradictions are not actually contradictions at all. They usually arise from a misunderstanding of how scientific evidence is generated. But there's a simple idea that helps clear up this confusion. Research can be viewed through different levels, and each level offers a different piece of the truth. So we have multiple levels. And the first level is theoretical research. This is where ideas, where models, simulations are developed often in controlled settings. In computer science, this includes algorithmic theory, cryptographic proofs, AI models tested in idealized environments. In engineering, it involves stress tests in virtual simulations or mathematical models predicting material behavior. In medicine, it includes laboratory experiments where drugs are tested on isolated cells or animals. However, this kind of research is powerful because it allows scientists to explore fundamental principles without the complexity of real-world variables. But of course, it has limitations. A theoretical model that performs well in a controlled simulation may struggle when exposed to unpredictable conditions. Or a drug that eliminates cancer in mice might prove ineffective or even harmful in human trials. Beyond theory, there's observational research, where patterns, behaviors are analyzed in real-world settings without direct intervention. In computer science, this might involve case studies that examine how a particular software system performed after deployment. In engineering, it could be an analysis of structural failures in real-world bridges or airplanes. In medicine, epidemiological studies track health trends across populations to identify potential links between lifestyle and obesity and disease. Now, this approach can reveal important correlations, but it does not necessarily establish cause and effect. And this is important. For example, a study found that people who watch television and movies more often tend to be more obese. But is it reasonable to conclude that television and movies cause obesity? Of course not. We need to consider that people who watch a lot of movies might also be more sedentary, or they may snack more while watching. There are indeed observational studies like this paper that have found correlations between high screen time and increased risk of obesity. But those studies do not claim that TV itself causes obesity. That's absurd. Which leads to the key point. Just because two things are related does not mean that one causes the other. Or in other words, correlation does not imply causation. And now, this brings us full circle. This is exactly what I was referring to earlier with the poster on intermittent fasting. Because without peer review and without a clear demonstration of causality, we must interpret such claims with caution. Otherwise, we risk jumping to conclusions like assuming that watching television causes obesity, and in doing so, we may end up spreading misinformation ourselves. Higher up, you have experimental research, where interventions are tested under controlled conditions to determine cause and effect. For example, in engineering, real-world stress tests are conducted on materials. Wind tunnels are used to study aerodynamics, and new building techniques are trialed before large-scale implementation. In medicine, these take the form of randomized controlled trials where patients are randomly assigned treatments or placebos to test the effectiveness of new therapies. Experimental research, as I said, carries the most weight because it can isolate variables and minimize external conditions. But it's not always practical. Some studies are too expensive. Uh, Others are too difficult or even unethical to conduct. For example, researchers cannot deliberately expose people to cyber attacks just to test a security protocol. And of course, they cannot randomly assign people to high-risk health behaviors to see what happens. So let's try to answer now, why do some findings seem to contradict each other? And the answer usually lies in which level is being used. So to truly understand what's going on, all three levels must be considered together. When they align, the evidence is strong. When they don't, experimental research carries the most weight because, as I said, it's the only method that directly tests cause and effect. Theoretical research alone is the weakest. No matter how elegant a concept appears on paper, it must withstand real-world scrutiny before it can be trusted. But even experimental research has its limits. A single experiment, no matter how rigorous, reflects only one set of conditions, one moment in time, and one specific population. That's why, in order to get closer to the truth, we need to go beyond individual studies and look at the bigger picture. So, at the top of the research hierarchy, you have meta-analysis and systematic reviews, studies that do not just look at one experiment, but synthesize the results of many. Now, these approaches combine data from multiple studies, sometimes spanning years, to identify consistent patterns and broader trends. Now, this process helps filter out anomalies, reduces the impact of individual study biases, and offers a more comprehensive, a more holistic understanding of complex issues. Meta-analysis and systematic reviews are considered the gold standard across disciplines, from medicine to education to physics and economics. For example, in medicine, a clinical trial might suggest that a drug is effective, but a meta-analysis pulling data from dozens of trials can reveal whether that finding holds up across diverse populations or conditions. Now, recognizing this pattern is like learning how a magic trick works. Once you see how scientific evidence is built, you cannot be misled by isolated claims. So the next time you hear an extraordinary statement about AI, about cybersecurity, engineering, or medicine, take a step back and ask, are they considering all the levels of research or just one? That's how you can separate hype from reality. But even when people manage to find solid sources, solid studies, they still run into another problem, their own biases. And one of the biggest pitfalls in your research is overconfidence. Because people often assume that after reading a few articles, or even better, after watching a couple of YouTube videos, they have mastered a subject. But just because I read a research article about cybersecurity, this does not mean I can now build an entire defense system. Just because I read a case study about a successful startup does not mean I can go out and run a billion-euro company. Expertise takes time, and even the top experts in a field are constantly revising their understanding based on new evidence. And actually, they have a name for that, but you may have heard it, the Dunning-Kruger effect. Another big trap is confirmation bias, because people often do not actually research to find the truth. They research to prove that they were right all along. For instance, if I already believe that AI is dangerous, I'm going to look for articles that reinforce that belief. Or if I think blockchain is the future of everything, I'm going to ignore evidence that suggests otherwise. It's human nature, but it's also dangerous. And there's what I call the first idea syndrome, the tendency to latch onto the first explanation you find because uncertainty is uncomfortable. But what do we mean when we say that uncertainty is uncomfortable? Well, consider this fascinating finding. Psychological studies have shown that people feel more stress when there's a 50% chance of getting an electric shock than when they know for sure that it's coming. Pretty fascinating. That's because uncertainty feels worse than bad news, and it's why people often rush to conclusions instead of staying open to multiple perspectives. So we haven't talked about AI yet, but let's recap what we have covered so far. And I've gathered the key takeaways in this slide. So understanding the red flags of misinformation, knowing where to find the reliable sources, recognizing the research hierarchy, and being aware of the hidden traps in thinking, these can equip you with the essential tools to make informed and thoughtful decisions. Well, let me show you how this actually plays out in real life. A few years ago, a close friend of mine was diagnosed with an aggressive form of ovarian cancer. Multiple doctors, experts in their fields, evaluated her case and anonymously agreed it was stage 4. Now, for those unfamiliar, stage 4 means the cancer has metastasized, spreading to distant organs, making it the most advanced, the most difficult to treat stage. The prognosis was grim, was tough. Every doctor we spoke to gave the same estimate. She had a maximum of 3 months to live. And there was a consensus, a clear conclusion drawn from established medical knowledge. Now, as you know, I'm not a doctor. I do not work in the medical field, and my expertise is in computer science and not oncology. But what I do know is how to navigate research systematically, how to filter out and find the most reliable, up-to-date information. So I decided to use the very same research tools I've described to see if there was anything at all that we might have overlooked. So I started with Google Scholar, not Google Scholar, and a basic search for ovarian cancer, as you can see, returned almost 3 million results, which is overwhelming. But I refined my search by adding terms like treatment and cure, which narrowed the results significantly. And as I filtered through the studies, I came across something that we hadn't heard the doctors mention, HIPEC or hypothermic intraperitoneal chemotherapy. And I read that it was a procedure that combines surgery with heated chemotherapy applied directly inside the abdomen. And as I read more, I found compelling research suggesting that this procedure, HIPEC, had been used in some cases of late-stage ovarian cancer with promising outcomes, extending survival far beyond the star prognosis. And I came across one particular paper published by a Greek doctor, Dr. Spiliotis and his team, that caught my attention. The study, which is available on Springerlink, detailed the outcomes of patients who had undergone HIPEC. And the results were encouraging. And so, armed with this new information, we arranged a meeting with Dr. Spiliotis in his office in Thessaloniki. Now, here's the thing. HIPEC was not part of the standard clinical protocol for her case. And that mattered. That mattered a lot because the vast majority of doctors we consulted outright rejected it. A few were skeptical, but most of them were dismissive. They said it wasn't proven, they said it was too risky, or simply not worth considering. However, while HIPEC was, as I said, outside official medical guidelines and rejected by most doctors, the scientific evidence, along with the explanation provided by the doctor who supports the process and authored the study, and whom, as I said, we visited in Thessaloniki, left a small window of hope. And you understand, for a patient given only 3 months to live, the decision was not a difficult one. So, to cut a long story short, here's how it ended. She chose to undergo the HIPEC procedure, and the result. She didn't live for just 3 months, she lived for 5 more years. She has since passed away, but 5 years was time she was never supposed to have, time she used to travel, to be with family, to live beyond what was considered possible. Now, some of you may think that this story is an anecdote, and if you've been following along, you know that an anecdote, an individual story, no matter how compelling, does not have inherent reliability. However, as you can see, my story is backed by strong scientific evidence. A peer-reviewed paper along with several other studies authored by research doctors detailing the benefits of this medical procedure for patients. Of course, The reliability lies in the published publication, not in my personal narration. So in similar cases, you shouldn't take any single person's story as definitive proof of anything. What you should do is apply the same research tools I've shown you. And if you find yourself at a crossroads, facing a decision where the stakes are high, do not rely on just one source, one story, or one person's opinion. Use the tools, read the research, understand the hierarchy of evidence, because when it comes to making the right decisions, knowledge is power. Now, another story that sparked intense debate due to the competing evidence is the origin of COVID-19. Now, the origin of COVID-19 has been a topic of intense debate from the moment the virus began spreading globally. Was it a natural spillover from animals to humans, similar to previous coronavirus outbreaks? Or was it the result of a lab experiment? Scientists, journalists, policymakers have all weighed in, and even well-known figures have suggested that the virus could have originated from a lab, from a medical lab. But here's the real question. How do we, as individuals, search for the truth? How can we go beyond speculation and opinion to find the best available evidence? Once again, we turn to structured research tools like the ones I showed you. So in our case, if we use the virus's formal scientific name, we are more likely to find peer-reviewed studies. And a quick search, as you can see, yields about 2.6 million results, which is overwhelming, but we can refine it by adding the phrase origin of, which narrows it down to less than 1 million, still a lot. But as we scan through, we notice something interesting. The third result is titled The Proximal Origin of SARS-CoV-2, published in Nature Medicine. Now, here's why this matters. In academic research, one of the strongest indicators of credibility is how often a paper is cited by other researchers. And when other scientists reference a study in their own work, it means they found its data, methodology, or conclusions valuable. This particular paper, as you can see, has been cited extensively, far more than most studies in this topic. And here's another crucial point. Citations are rarely negative. When a study is widely referenced, it's usually because it has contributed meaningful evidence to the discussion. So what does this paper actually say? Well, the paper analyzes the genetic structure of the virus and compares it to other coronaviruses, the previous coronaviruses. And one of its key findings is that COVID-19 has certain features, particularly in the spike protein, that make it highly effective at binding to human cells. According to this paper, if the virus had been engineered in a lab, scientists would have likely used known genetic templates to optimize this binding. But interestingly, the study found that COVID-19 does not have the hallmarks of artificial manipulation. The authors conclude that there's no evidence supporting the idea that COVID-19 was engineered. While they do not rule out the possibility of a lab escape entirely, they argue that all known genetic evidence aligns with a natural origin. So what does this tell us? Well, first, it reminds us why we must be careful with how we evaluate information. So if we had just relied on news articles or social media debates, we would see a mix of speculation, politics, and personal opinions. But by using structured research methods, by looking at the most cited studies, by critically analyzing their findings, we can approach the topic with a much clearer understanding. And second, it reinforces the same point I've been making throughout this webinar. No single study can give us absolute certainty. Science evolves. More data may emerge. But even at every step, our responsibility is to use the best tools available, to examine the strongest evidence, and to remain open to refining our understanding based on what the research actually tells us. Because when it comes to critical questions, whether in science, education, or technology, real knowledge is not about who argues the loudest. It's about who looks at the data most carefully. Another major source of information has emerged in recent years, one that is now shaping how research is conducted across disciplines, and I'm referring to the large language models and generative AI. And really, it would be a significant omission if I didn't mention these new tools in this webinar. So these AI-driven systems like ChatGPT, Gemini, Claude are trained on vast amounts of text data and function as powerful tools for generating human-like responses to user queries. At their core, they predict the next most likely word in a sequence, which allows them to generate entire paragraphs, summarize complex topics, and even provide reasoned arguments on various subjects. Unlike traditional search engines that return a list of links, these models offer synthesized responses, making them an appealing option for quickly digesting large bodies of information. Now, a fascinating use of these models lies in their ability to make complex scientific research more accessible. Let's face it, some research articles are the result of years of meticulous work, with dense technical language, maths, and highly specialized concepts. Most of us do not have the background to understand them, and even seasoned scientists sometimes struggle to digest these papers in a single read. And of course, the challenge becomes even greater for individuals outside the field who want to understand the implications of a study but find the terminology overwhelming. But this is where large language models can play a transformative role. By feeding these dense academic papers into AI tools like ChatGPT, we can generate more digestible summaries. We can generate simplified explanations or high-level overviews that highlight the core findings, methodologies, and conclusions. This does not just help researchers quickly grasp the essence of complex studies, it also opens the door for non-experts to engage with scientific knowledge that would otherwise feel inaccessible. But here's the challenge. While these models can process and summarize research at an incredible scale, they do not possess actual understanding. Their responses are derived from statistical patterns rather than genuine reasoning or expert knowledge. And this has led to a wave of enthusiasm, but also skepticism. Scientists and researchers across all fields are now investigating how to harness this technology while ensuring its reliability. At the University of Thessaly, we focused on how these models could be applied to education, particularly in improving academic practices and support systems. Our first study explored how educators perceive and use generative AI tools in higher education. Through surveys, we found that many faculty members were already incorporating AI into their work, using it to draft course materials, automate grading, and enhance administrative efficiency. However, while educators recognize the potential benefits of AI, they also express concerns about data privacy, reliability, and the risk of students becoming overly dependent on AI-generated responses. Perhaps most strikingly, the study underscored the lack of institutional guidance and training, signaling an urgent need for universities to develop clear policies on AI integration in education. Another study we conducted examined how generative AI can support PhD mentoring. Pursuing a PhD is demanding. It requires deep knowledge, rigorous research design, and critical thinking. Of course, it's also time-consuming, both for the PhD student, and the supervisor. So we wanted to see whether ChatGPT could assist in this process, not replacing supervisors, but complementing them. So we designed a study where ChatGPT was used to generate academic guidance for a PhD proposal. We tested different types of prompts, some very general, others fine-tuned with domain-specific keywords, and then had external academic experts evaluate the responses, ChatGPT's responses. Now, the findings were clear. When ChatGPT was given a well-structured, topic-specific prompts, the quality of its recommendations was significantly higher. In fact, when experts rated the responses, there was a strong statistical agreement on which outputs were the most appropriate, indicating significant consensus. The takeaway: AI can support the process, but only when used correctly. It's not magic. It does not replace human expertise, at least not in its current form, not ChatGPT 4.5. Instead, it amplifies it when guided properly. Finally, we published another research on leveraging generative AI for academic advising. Now, this study was part of our work in the Invest European University Alliance. So, what did we find? We designed a comparative analysis evaluating AI-generated advising responses against human advisors across multiple dimensions, as you can see: acceptance, clarity, relevance, practicality, and impact. And the results. In some cases, AI performs surprisingly well, especially in clarity and relevance. Students found ChatGPT's responses structured, easy to follow, and of course, immediately available at any time. But, and this is important, when it came to deeply understanding a student's unique academic journey and challenges, AI fell short. There were statistically significant differences how students perceived AI versus human advisors. Generative AI could mimic expertise, but it lacked true contextual awareness. But we also confirmed another important limitation: AI hallucination. The tendency of generative AI models to confidently produce false or misleading information. And this is not just a minor flaw, it's a fundamental limitation that makes blind reliance on AI problematic. Because we must realize that AI does not know things in the way that experts do. It simply generates the most statistically likely response based on its training data. So when this process fails, it does not recognize its own mistakes. Instead, it presents misinformation with complete certainty. This is why AI is not a panacea. It can assist, but it cannot replace the critical thinking required to verify information. And this is where everything ties back to the research tools I showed you earlier. Whether you are reading a research paper, listening to an influencer, or asking ChatGPT for information, the key lesson remains the same. Do not take things at face value. You have to cross-check, you have to evaluate, and contextualize information using the right research methodologies. Especially today, as AI shapes our information landscape, critical evaluation is more important than ever. Because in today's world, the biggest challenge is not accessing information, it's discernment. And in this webinar, we have explored how trust is shaped, the biases that cloud our judgment, and the fine line between knowledge and misinformation, from the emotional pull of social media to the complexities of scientific research and research hierarchy. One thing is clear: critical thinking is not just useful, it's essential. Generative AI is changing the way we consume and create information. It can spread knowledge, but it can also spread mistakes, biases, and even falsehoods. The responsibility to separate fact from fiction still lies with us. Technology can help, but it cannot replace human judgment. As Marie Curie said, now is the time to understand more so that we may fear less. Let's keep that in mind so that in the next crisis, whether it's another pandemic or a new global challenge, we won't be misled again by misinformation. Because truth is not just something we find, it's something we must work for. And that's a responsibility we all share. So that was my last slide. Thank you for joining me today. Stay curious, stay critical, and most importantly, as I said, stay informed. Now, before we officially wrap up, we have reserved a few minutes to, well, we have exceeded our time. We have reserved a few minutes to try and answer some of your questions. As you know, we've been using Slido throughout the webinar to collect your thoughts and queries. So let's take a look and see what's come in. I'll go through a few of the top questions now and do my best to respond clearly and concisely. All right. Just a minute. Okay, one question. One question that caught my attention, and I think this is an excellent one. It's about something I mentioned earlier when I was explaining the odds ratio. Well, the question is, do odds ratio actually measure risk? And honestly, this is a very fair and important observation, because Technically speaking, no, it does not measure risk in the strictest sense. It compares odds, not probabilities. But in my talk, I try to simplify it by saying it measures risk because I wanted to make the concept accessible and relatable, especially for those who do not come from a statistical background. And uh, this is important. But in many cases, especially when outcomes are rare, odds ratio can behave similarly to risk ratios. So I believe the simplified explanation still gets the core idea across. But the person who raised this is absolutely right to notice that distinction. And actually, this is exactly the kind of critical thinking I've been hoping to encourage throughout this session, not just listening to information, but questioning how it's presented and recognizing when simplification trades off with precision. So thank you for that question. It was spot on. Okay, I can stop sharing. I can stop sharing. Okay. This one, another question gets philosophical. Any advice on how to explain to students that correlation isn't causation? Well, in my presentation, I used an example, a TV watching and obesity example, if you remember. And I believe this is a great tool. You can also show observed correlations like how ice cream sales correlate with shark attacks to make the point stick. For example, during the summer months, both ice cream sales and shark attacks increase. So if we only looked at the data, we might be tempted to think that eating ice cream causes shark attacks or vice versa, but of course, what's really going on is a third variable, the hot weather. So when it's hot, people go to the beach more, which increases the chance of shark attacks, and they also buy more ice cream. So the correlation is real, but causation is totally absent. Now, this kind of example is powerful because it's obviously observed, and that absurdity makes the lesson stick. And it helps students understand that just because two things happen together does not mean one caused the other. Because once students grasp the principle with something silly and absurd, they are much more prepared to apply when the stakes are high, like in medicine, technology, or public policy. Here's another question that touches a key issue. What do we do when newer research challenges a paper that's already super well cited? Well, this is an excellent point. But science is always provisional. A highly cited paper means that it was impactful. It has impact, but impact does not mean permanent truth. When new research emerges, it's a signal to reevaluate. The fact that science can overturn its own conclusions, this is not a flaw. It's a strength. That's how knowledge evolves. And one of the most famous examples comes from physics. You know, for centuries, Newton's laws of motion and gravity were considered unshakable. They explained how apples fall, how planets move. His work was foundational. But then along came Einstein with his theory of general relativity, and suddenly Newton's ideas were no longer the whole picture. They still work incredibly well in everyday contexts, but at high speeds or near massive objects like black holes, Einstein's equations take over. So what do we take from that? That Newton was wrong? Not at all. His work was essential, and it still is, but Einstein helped refine it, extend it, improve it. That's what science is all about: refinement, not replacement, progress, not perfection. So when a new study comes and challenges an older one, even a famous one like Newton's Principia, that's a moment to learn, not panic. The ability of science to revise itself in light of new evidence, that's not a weakness, it's a feature. It's how knowledge evolves, how knowledge grows. Okay, someone else asked, I'm not a researcher, how can someone like me check if a study or a claim is actually credible? Well, this is very common, especially without paid access. And it's one reason I focus so much on Google Scholar in the webinar, because even without institutional access, Google Scholar can lead you to free full text versions of many articles. You can look for links to the right of the title. Also, as I said in my presentation, review articles and meta-analysis are your friends. They summarize broader evidence and are more beginner friendly. There are also tools like Connected Papers or DBLB for computer science or PubMed for medical topics that can also help you trace how ideas evolve. Okay, one last question to wrap things up. How do we use AI in the classroom without students becoming totally dependent on it? Is there a balance? Well, I love this one because it's not just practical, it's about shaping how we think going forward. And really, that's the future of digital literacy. The key is not to present AI as some magical oracle that always gives you the right answer. Instead, we should teach students, I believe, how uh, to teach them how these systems work, what they are good at, and just as importantly, where they fall short. But beyond that, we need to train students not just to use AI, but to question it. If they get an answer, we want them to ask, does this claim come from a real study? Is there a source cited? Can I find this in the original research literature? That's how AI becomes a tool for engagement, not just a shortcut. It's like teaching someone carpentry. You don't hand them a hammer and say, this will build a house for you. You teach them how to hold it, when to use it, and when to put it down. So yes, AI is powerful, but in the classroom, it should be what the hammer is to the carpenter, a tool that amplifies human skill, not replaces it. Now, the goal is not just answers, it's building judgments. So we have now exceeded our scheduled time, so we won't be able to answer any more questions today. I want to sincerely thank you for your participation, for your contributions throughout the session. If you have any additional feedback or questions, feel free to submit them through Slido along with your contact details, and I'll do my best to answer them asynchronously after this event. Please stay tuned to the Invest Alliance for future events. Visit our official website to stay updated and to learn more about upcoming webinars. We have more webinars scheduled, workshops, and other collaborative opportunities. Once again, thank you for joining us today. Wishing you all the best in your work and especially in your research. Thank you very much.